The room smelled of old timber and spilled fire whiskey, the sort of staleness that suggested decades of neglect rather than mere months. Dumbledore sat in the rickety chair, its left rear leg shorter than the others, causing an irritating tilt, and tried to arrange his face into an expression of polite encouragement. Across from him, Sybil Trelawney perched on the edge of a threadbare settee, her shawls creating a sort of fabric avalanche around her thin shoulders. She had been talking for nearly 20 minutes about her great-great-grandmother, the celebrated seer Cassandra Trelawney, and Dumbledore found himself cataloguing the room's deficiencies to avoid showing his impatience. He shouldn't have come himself. Minerva had offered, and she would have been kinder about the rejection. But something, perhaps simple curiosity, perhaps the thin hope that genuine sight still existed somewhere in the magical world, had drawn him to this shabby room above the Hogshead on a cold October evening. Sybil was describing her qualifications now, her voice breathy and uncertain, hands fluttering like trapped birds. Dumbledore watched her and felt a familiar weight settling in his chest. She was nervous, desperate even. He could see it in the way she leaned forward, in the slight tremor of her fingers as she adjusted her enormous spectacles. She needed this position. And he had almost certainly wasted an evening he could have spent on correspondence, on order business, on the 100 small tasks that accumulated like snowdrifts when one attempted to fight a war while also running a school. Of course, Sybil was saying, the inner eye is not something one can simply demonstrate upon request. It comes when it will, you understand, Headmaster. The universe speaks in its own time. Naturally, Dumbledore murmured, and meant to follow it with a gentle dismissal, some kind words about keeping her application on file. The words never came. Sybil's voice changed. It wasn't dramatic, not at first, just a subtle dropping of pitch, a roughening of tone. But Dumbledore had heard genuine prophecy once before, in his long-ago youth, and he recognized the quality of it, the way the air seemed to thicken, the way his own heartbeat became suddenly audible in his ears. Her eyes had gone unfocused, pupils wide and distant. Her hands, which had been fidgeting with her shawl, went perfectly still. When she spoke, it was in a voice that belonged to no one, and yet carried the weight of absolute certainty. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies. Dumbledore didn't move, couldn't move. Every instinct screamed at him to memorize the words, to catch each syllable before it dissolved into the musty air. His hand, which had been resting on the arm of his chair, tightened until his knuckles showed white beneath his age-spotted skin. And the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but he will have power the Dark Lord knows not. No, Dumbledore thought. No, please, not this. Not another child. Not another prophecy pulling at the threads of lives not yet fully begun. And either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. The silence that followed felt thick enough to choke on. Sybil blinked, her eyes clearing with disconcerting speed. She looked around the room as if uncertain where she was, then focused on Dumbledore with an expression of vague confusion. "I'm sorry, Headmaster. Did I say something? I sometimes lose the thread when the inner eye—" "You did wonderfully, my dear," Dumbledore heard himself say, his voice steady despite the ice spreading through his veins. Most impressive. I believe we can offer you the position." Her face transformed, delight chasing away anxiety. She thanked him profusely, asked about terms and quarters, and Dumbledore responded, with half his mind, the automatic courtesies flowing without conscious thought. The other half was already turning over the prophecy's words, examining them from every angle, seeing the terrible shape of them. Born as the 7th month dies. 2 families in the order matched that timing, James and Lily Potter, expecting their first child, Frank and Alice Longbottom, due around the same time. Both couples had defied Voldemort directly, more than once. Both had earned his particular hatred. 2 possible children, 2 potential targets. And Dumbledore, sitting in this wretched room above a disreputable pub, now held the knowledge that would make them so. After Sybil left, still thanking him, still radiating gratitude, Dumbledore remained in his chair. The room seemed colder now, or perhaps that was just his own blood running chill in his veins. He should leave, should return to Hogwarts, to the warmth of his office, to forks and lemon drops, and the comfortable trappings of power he'd surrounded himself with. Instead, he sat and stared at the wall where damp had created a map of imaginary continents. The sound of footsteps on the stairs, heavy, hurried, barely registered until they'd already passed the door. Someone had been listening. Someone had heard. Dumbledore was on his feet in an instant, his wand in his hand, with the unconscious speed of a century's practice. He moved to the door, opened it, caught a glimpse of a dark cloak disappearing around the turn of the staircase. The gait was familiar, the desperate speed of it. Severus Snape. And just like that, the prophecy stopped being a private burden and became a weapon loose in the world. Dumbledore descended the stairs at a measured pace, though every instinct urged him to run. By the time he reached the street, Snape was gone. Disapparated, certainly, racing to his master with this precious intelligence. The prophecy wouldn't doom both children. Voldemort would hear only part of it, only what Severus had managed to overhear before continuing up the stairs. He would hear enough to know a child threatened him, perhaps enough to identify the families. Dumbledore stood on the cobblestones of Hogsmeade, breathing the cold October air, and felt the future narrowing around him like a fist. He could have dismissed Sybil more quickly, could have sent Minerva in his place, could have held the interview at Hogwarts, in his office, behind wards and portraits, and 100 protections that would have prevented eavesdropping. Could have, should have, didn't. And now a child, or 2 children, would pay for his carelessness. The walk back to Hogwarts took longer than it should have. Dumbledore found himself moving slowly, his feet heavy, as though his body knew what his mind was still refusing to fully accept. The castle rose before him, its windows glowing warm against the darkness, and he felt a sudden irrational anger at it, at the weight of it, at the 100 years of choices that had led him here, to this moment, to this knowledge. He had sworn, after Ariana, after Gellert, had sworn he would never again play games with other people's lives, would never again convince himself that he knew best, that the greater good justified the smaller cruelties. And yet, here he was, carrying a prophecy that would shape everything, already calculating how to use it. His office was warm when he arrived, Fawkes trilling softly from his perch. Dumbledore crossed to his desk and sat heavily in his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 150 years. He should record the prophecy, should place it in the department of mysteries where such things were kept, should tell the order, should tell James and Lily, should tell Frank and Alice. His hand, reaching for parchment, stopped. What would he tell them? That one of their unborn children was prophesied to either destroy or be destroyed by the most dangerous dark wizard of the age. That he couldn't even tell them which child because the prophecy's wording allowed for both. He tried to imagine it. Lily's face, so young, still round with pregnancy. James's fierce protectiveness, the way his hand would move instinctively to shield his wife. Frank's quiet courage, Alice's steady gaze. What parent could bear such knowledge? What parent could look at their newborn child and not see a weapon, a target, a sacrifice waiting to happen? And if Voldemort learned which child the prophecy truly meant, if he focused all his considerable power on eliminating that specific threat, what chance would an infant have? The thought settled in Dumbledore's mind with the weight of justification. He could protect them better if they didn't know, could keep the children safer if the parents remained ignorant of the true stakes. Knowledge would only make them afraid, might make them reckless, might lead them to choices that would expose the child further. It was wisdom, he told himself, strategy, the kind of difficult decision that someone had to make, that he'd spent a lifetime learning to make. It wasn't control. It wasn't the old familiar arrogance that had cost him everything he'd loved. Was it? Dumbledore rose and crossed to the window, looking out over the grounds. The lake was a sheet of black glass under the thin moonlight. Somewhere out there, Voldemort was learning of the prophecy. Somewhere out there, two families were preparing nurseries, choosing names, imagining futures their children might not live to see. And here, in this tower, Dumbledore was already planning, already calculating, already deciding what truths to share and then what truths to bury. He thought of Gellert, of their summer together, of the plans they'd made, for the greater good, always for the greater good. They'd been so certain, so convinced of their own brilliance, so sure that they could see further and clearer than ordinary people with their ordinary concerns. Ariana had died for that certainty. Dumbledore pressed his forehead against the coal glass and closed his eyes. He could choose differently this time, could tell James and Lily everything, could give them the prophecy's full weight and let them decide how to protect their child, could trust them, trust their love, trust that parents might know better than a tired old man how to save their own. But if he was wrong, if the knowledge made them visible to Voldemort, if their fear led to mistakes, if their child died because Dumbledore had been honest instead of strategic, could he bear that? Could he survive another Ariana, another death laid at the feet of his own noble intentions? The prophecy's words echoed in his mind. Either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. One of two children, marked for death or murder. And Dumbledore, who had spent decades trying not to rule the world, was already deciding their fates. He returned to his desk and drew out fresh parchment. His hand was steady as he began to write. Letters to James and Lily, to Frank and Alice, warning them, offering the Order's protection, saying everything except the one thing that mattered most. The words flowed easily. They always did, when he was being kind while keeping secrets. When he finished, he sat back and read what he'd written. Warm words, careful words, Words that would make them trust him, rely on him, believe he was telling them everything they needed to know. Words that left them blind to the true danger, dependent on his wisdom, shaped to his design. Dumbledore set down his quill and looked at Fawkes, who regarded him with those ancient, knowing eyes. "I'm protecting them," he said aloud, testing the words, trying to believe them. Knowledge would only hurt them. "This is mercy." Fawkes said nothing. Phoenix Song could heal, could strengthen, could bring hope even in darkness. But it couldn't absolve, couldn't make right choices out of wrong ones, no matter how necessary they seemed. Dumbledore folded the letters with fingers that trembled only slightly. Tomorrow, he would send them. Tomorrow, he would begin the careful work of protecting two families who didn't know the real reason they needed protecting. Tonight, he would sit in his tower and feel the terrible weight of words spoken and words withheld and wonder, not for the first time, and certainly not for the last, whether wisdom and cowardice might sometimes be the same thing, wearing different names. The Potter cottage was everything Dumbledore expected, and somehow more painful for it. Warm. That was the first thing that struck him as James opened the door, the wave of warmth, both literal and something less tangible, that seemed to pour out into the December cold. Cooking smells, wood smoke, the faint undertone of baby powder and fresh laundry. The ordinary, precious smell of a young family making a home. "Professor!" James's face split into a grin, though Dumbledore could see the wariness beneath it. They all had that now, the members of the Order. That tension that never quite left their shoulders, the way their hands moved unconsciously toward their wands whenever someone appeared unexpectedly. Come in. Lily's just put the kettle on." Dumbledore stepped inside and felt the wards settle around him. Good wards, well constructed, though not nearly strong enough for what was coming. The cottage's interior was small but cheerful, decorated with a kind of defiant domesticity. Photographs covered every surface, most of them moving. James and Lily's wedding, the marauders in various states of mischief, baby pictures of what must be young Harry. Lily emerged from the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel. 7 months pregnant, her belly round beneath a worn jumper, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She looked so young. They both did. Barely out of Hogwarts, really, and already playing at this adult life with its cottage and its baby and its war happening just outside their door. "Headmaster," she said, and her smile was genuine, but her eyes were sharp. Lily had always been sharp. "This is unexpected. Is everything—" "Everyone is quite well," Dumbledore said quickly, hating the flash of fear that crossed her face. This was what the war had done to them all, made every unexpected visit a harbinger of death. "I simply wished to call on you both, to see how you're managing." The tea was hot and strong, served in mismatched mugs at a kitchen table that wobbled slightly. James talked too much, the way he always had when nervous, filling the silence with Quidditch analysis and jokes about Sirius's latest near disaster on an Order mission. Lily said less, but watched Dumbledore with those green eyes that missed very little. "You didn't come just to check on us," she said finally, cutting through James's rambling with gentle directness. "Did you, Headmaster?" Dumbledore set down his mug. The tea had gone lukewarm while he'd been gathering his words, choosing them, discarding them, choosing again. "I'm afraid," he said slowly, that Voldemort has taken a particular interest in your family. The silence that followed was absolute. James's hand found Lily's across the table, their fingers intertwining with the unconscious ease of long practice. "How particular?" James asked, and his voice had lost all its earlier lightness. "Enough that I believe you should consider additional protections, perhaps even going into hiding once the baby arrives." "Hiding?" Lily's other hand moved to her belly, protective, instinctive. "For how long? Until Voldemort is defeated?" "That could be years." James's jaw tightened. "We just disappear, leave the Order, stop fighting." "You'd be fighting by staying alive," Dumbledore said, and heard the manipulation in his own words, even as he spoke them. "By keeping your son safe. That is fighting, James. Perhaps the most important fight of all." He watched them exchange a look, that silent communication of couples who'd learned to speak without words. Saw Lily's fear warring with her stubbornness, James's protective fury battling his guilt at the thought of abandoning his friends. "Why us specifically?" Lily asked. "We've defied him, yes, but so have others. The Longbottoms, the Prewets, the McKinnons." "You have been particularly visible," Dumbledore said, which was true, and also not the truth at all. "Your work with the Order has not gone unnoticed, and Voldemort does not tolerate defiance well. More true things that serve to bury the real truth. That somewhere in the Department of Mysteries, a prophecy was being recorded in a sphere of spun glass. That Voldemort knew enough to be hunting, but not enough to be certain. That Harry Potter, not yet born, was already marked for death or destiny, and Dumbledore couldn't tell them which." "We'll think about it," James said finally. "After the baby comes, we'll talk to Sirius, work out the details." "I would urge you not to delay too long," Dumbledore said, gently. "Time is a luxury we may not have." He left them an hour later, with promises to stay in touch, to provide whatever protections the Order could offer. Stood on their doorstep while Lily hugged him goodbye, her belly pressed awkwardly between them, and felt the weight of his unspoken words like stones in his chest. "Your son is prophesied to destroy the Dark Lord or die trying. Voldemort will hunt him, will try to kill him. And I'm not telling you because knowing might make you reckless, might make you visible, might make you trust the wrong person or make the wrong choice. I'm not telling you because I think I know better, because I've decided that your ignorance is safer than your knowledge, because I'm protecting you from the truth, or protecting himself from the consequences of sharing it." The Longbottom home was different, larger, older, filled with the accumulated weight of generations. Frank's grandmother met him at the door, her face severe, though she softened slightly at the sight of him. "Headmaster, we weren't expecting you." "A surprise visit, I'm afraid. I hope to speak with Frank and Alice, if they're available." They were in the greenhouse. Of course they were. Alice had always been happiest with her hands in soil, and Frank had learned to share that happiness. Dumbledore found them there, Alice heavy with pregnancy, but still moving among the plants with easy grace. Frank at her side, pruning a particularly aggressive devil's snare. The conversation followed similar patterns, the same carefully chosen words, the same partial truths. Voldemort's interest, the need for protection, the suggestion of hiding, of keeping safe until the war's end. But Alice's reaction was different from Lily's. "No," she said simply, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "We're not hiding." "Alice," Frank started, but she shook her head. I'm not having this baby grow up in a cage, Frank. Not having him raised in fear, taught that survival means running. It's not running, Dumbledore said quietly. It's strategic withdrawal. There's no shame in it. Maybe not shame, Alice agreed. But there's no honor in it either. No life. We fight or we surrender, Headmaster. There's no middle ground. Dumbledore looked at her, this young woman, her face set with determination, her hands gentle on the leaves of a plant that could kill with a touch, and felt something twist in his chest. Admiration, perhaps, or grief for the choice she was making without knowing all its dimensions. At least consider stronger wards, he said. The Fidelius charm, perhaps. It would allow you to stay in your home but make you unfindable to anyone not trusted with the secret. We'll think about it, Frank said, his hand finding Alice's shoulder. Always touching these couples, always grounding themselves in each other. After the baby comes, when we know what we're really dealing with, but they wouldn't know. That was the point. They'd never know until it was too late, because Dumbledore had decided that ignorance would keep them safer than truth. He left the Longbottoms as afternoon faded to evening, the winter sun already sinking toward the horizon. The greenhouse had been warm, almost stifling, but the December air felt colder than it should as he stepped back into it. January came, and with it, the babies. Harry Potter, born July 31st, 1980. Neville Longbottom, born July 30th, 1980. Both arriving as the 7th month died, both born to parents who had thrice defied the Dark Lord, both fitting the prophecy perfectly. Dumbledore visited them in turn, these two families with their new sons, held each baby with hands that had held so many children over so many years, and felt the particular terror of knowing what he knew. One of these children would face Voldemort. One of them carried power the Dark Lord knew not. One of them would live or die based on choices not yet made, battles not yet fought. And Dumbledore couldn't tell which one. The not knowing should have been a comfort. If he didn't know which child the prophecy truly meant, then perhaps Voldemort wouldn't either. Perhaps both families could be protected. Perhaps both children could be kept safe. But late at night, alone in his tower, Dumbledore found himself returning again and again to the same thought. If he had to choose, if circumstances forced him to protect one child over the other, how would he decide? By the prophecy's wording? By the family's willingness to hide? By some cold calculation of which child had the better chance of survival, of victory? The questions haunted him through the winter and into spring. Each order meeting, each report of Voldemort's movements, each piece of intelligence that suggested the Dark Lord was searching for something, for someone, added weight to the burden of his knowledge. In March, Lily sent him a photograph of Harry's first smile. In April, Alice wrote about Neville's fascination with the plants in their greenhouse, how he'd reach for the leaves with chubby fingers and laugh when they moved at his touch. Ordinary letters from ordinary parents, proud of their ordinary babies who were anything but. Dumbledore kept the letters in his desk drawer, beneath other correspondence, took them out sometimes when he was alone, read them again, studied the photographs of two dark-haired boys who both had their mother's eyes. One of them was the subject of prophecy. One of them would either save the wizarding world or die trying, and he still hadn't told either family the truth. The justifications came easily now, worn smooth with repetition. They were safer not knowing. Knowledge would make them paranoid, make them make mistakes. The prophecy might not even be real. Trelawney had shown no other signs of genuine sight. Better to protect them without burdening them, to keep them innocent a little longer, to preserve some small corner of normalcy in their lives. But beneath the justifications, quieter and more insistent, came the other thoughts, the ones he tried not to examine too closely in the bright light of day. If they knew about the prophecy, they might take matters into their own hands, might make choices Dumbledore hadn't anticipated, create variables he couldn't control. Might even, and this was the thought that kept him awake longest, succeed without him. Might find a way to protect their children that didn't require Dumbledore's careful orchestration, his strategic positioning, his grand design. And wouldn't that be terrible? To have carried this burden, made these choices, kept these secrets, and then discover they hadn't been necessary at all. In May, Voldemort attacked the Bones family. In June, he murdered the Preweds. The war was escalating, the casualties mounting, and still Dumbledore kept his silence. He told himself it was wisdom. He told himself it was mercy. He told himself it was necessary. And alone in his tower, with Fawkes sleeping on his perch, and the castle quiet around him, Dumbledore sometimes allowed himself to wonder if he was simply telling himself lies in kinder and kinder words, until he could no longer tell the difference between protection and control. The summer heat pressed against the windows of his office. Somewhere out there, two families were treasuring their baby's first months, capturing memories in photographs and journals, building futures they believed they'd live to see. And Dumbledore, who had spent a lifetime trying not to rule the world, sat in his tower and ruled them anyway, with silence, with secrets, with the terrible kindness of truths withheld. For their own good, he told himself. Always, always, for their own good. The wards shivered at 11:30 on a Tuesday night in October, and Dumbledore knew before he even looked up from his correspondence who had come calling. The quality of the disturbance was distinctive, desperate, urgent, edged with the kind of panic that made even careful wizards careless with their magic. Severus Snape materialized in the center of the office without waiting for permission, his dark robes billowing around him, his face bone white and sheened with sweat despite the autumn chill. "Please," he said, and the word came out broken, hardly more than a breath. "Please, you have to... he's going to..." Dumbledore rose from his desk, his wand already in his hand, though he made no threatening gesture with it. Fawkes stirred on his perch, sensing the distress in the room, but remained silent. "Severus," Dumbledore said quietly, "sit down. Tell me what's happened." "No time." Severus shook his head violently, his lank hair whipping across his face. "No time. You don't understand. He's chosen. The prophecy. He's decided." The prophecy. Of course. Dumbledore felt his chest tighten, felt the careful edifice of his plans shift and resettle around this new information. "Which family?" he asked, keeping his voice level with an effort. "The Potters." Severus's voice cracked on the name. "Lily. He's going to kill her, kill them all, and I told him, it's my fault." He broke then, properly broke, his shoulders shaking with sobs he couldn't quite suppress. Dumbledore watched him. This young man barely passed his own Hogwarts days, and felt something shift in his chest. Not quite pity. Severus had made his choices, had joined Voldemort willingly, had carried that mark on his arm with what appeared to be pride, but something adjacent to pity, something that recognized the particular agony of consequences finally made real. "Sit," Dumbledore said again, more gently, and this time Severus collapsed into the chair as though his legs had simply given out. The story came in fragments, punctuated by silences and shuddering breaths. Severus had heard part of the prophecy. Not all of it, he insisted, just fragments through the door of the room at the Hog's Head. Enough to know it concerned a child who could threaten the Dark Lord. Enough to carry that intelligence back to Voldemort like the loyal servant he'd been trying to be. And Voldemort had listened and thought and decided. The Potters, James, whom Severus had hated since childhood with a loathing that had never quite faded. Lily, whom he'd loved since childhood with a devotion that had never quite died. And their son, barely a year old, who existed only because Lily had chosen James instead of him. "He won't spare her," Severus said, his voice raw. I begged him. I said she didn't have to die, that the child was the threat, not her. And he laughed. He laughed and said he'd see what he could do. And I knew he was lying. Dumbledore said nothing, simply stood by the window, looking out over the dark grounds, letting Severus speak himself empty. "It's my fault," Severus continued, quieter now. "I gave him the prophecy. I made her a target. I thought it wouldn't matter. Thought it was just more of Trelawney's nonsense. Thought—" He pressed his hands to his face. "I wasn't thinking at all. And now she's going to die because of me." "Not necessarily," Dumbledore said, and turned from the window. "If you're willing to help me protect her." Severus's head snapped up, his dark eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "Anything. I'll do anything. Just please save her." "Anything," Dumbledore repeated softly, and felt the weight of that word settle between them. This was the moment then, the pivot point. He could send Severus away, could try to protect the Potters with just the Order's resources, could maintain the distance he'd been so carefully cultivating. Or he could use this, use Severus's guilt and love and desperation, bind him to the cause not out of conviction but out of penance, shape him into the tool Dumbledore needed, someone inside Voldemort's circle, someone who could provide intelligence, someone expendable enough to risk but valuable enough to believe. The choice, when it came down to it, was no choice at all. "You will have to continue serving Voldemort," Dumbledore said. "Continue playing the loyal Death Eater. Bring him information. Information I provide you, carefully chosen. You will become my spy." Yes, no hesitation. Severus would have agreed to anything in that moment, and they both knew it. "It will be dangerous. If he discovers your true loyalty, he will kill you, slowly, and I will not be able to save you. I don't care. And if I cannot save Lily—" Dumbledore paused, made himself say it clearly, made sure Severus understood. "If she dies despite our best efforts, you will continue to spy for me. Will continue to risk yourself. In her memory, if for no other reason." Something flickered across Severus's face then. Pain, perhaps, or the first edge of understanding that he was being bound to something with no endpoint, no escape clause. But he nodded. "In her memory," he whispered. "Yes." Dumbledore moved to his desk, sat down, steepled his fingers. The practical part of his mind was already working, calculating, planning. Severus Snape embedded with the Death Eaters, able to provide intelligence from within. It was better than he'd dared hope for. better than anything the Order had managed to cultivate, and all it required was using a young man's love, his guilt, his desperate need for redemption, as a leash. "Tell me everything Voldemort knows about the prophecy," Dumbledore said. Severus recited the fragments he'd heard, the partial words that had been enough to doom the Potters, but not enough to reveal the prophecy's full shape. Dumbledore listened, his expression carefully neutral, and noted what was missing. The part about the Dark Lord marking his equal, the part about power the Dark Lord knew not, the crucial final line, "Either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives." Voldemort knew a child threatened him, knew that child would be born at July's end to parents who defied him, but he didn't know about the marking, didn't know about the deeper connection the prophecy implied, didn't know that killing the child might be more complicated than simple murder. Knowledge that Dumbledore still held close, still hadn't shared even with the family in question. "The Fidelius charm," Dumbledore said abruptly. "I'll convince them to use it, hide themselves completely. Voldemort won't be able to find them without their secret keeper's betrayal." "And you'll be the secret keeper?" Severus asked. "That would be safest, yes." But even as he said it, Dumbledore knew James would resist. James Potter, who trusted his friends more than he trusted authority, who would want Sirius Black or Remus Lupin or Peter Pettigrew to hold the secret, who would see the headmaster's offer as interference rather than protection. Dumbledore would suggest it, would advise it strongly. But if James refused, if he insisted on choosing someone else, well, Dumbledore would have tried, would have offered the protection. If the Potters chose unwisely, that would be their choice, not his. The thought sat uneasily in his mind. He pushed it aside. "You'll warn me if Voldemort gets any closer to finding them," Dumbledore continued. "Any intelligence, any plans, any movements toward the Potters, you'll tell me immediately." "Of course." Severus leaned forward, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. "But you have to promise me. Promise you'll keep her safe, whatever it takes." "I will do everything in my power," Dumbledore said, and meant it. Though his power had limits, though his plans had variables he couldn't control, though promising safety in wartime was promising something no one could truly guarantee. But Severus needed the promise, needed something to hold on to. So Dumbledore gave it, wrapped in sincerity, and watched the younger man's face ease slightly. "There's something else you should know," Dumbledore said carefully. "The prophecy, it could refer to two children, the Potter's son or the Longbottoms." Severus's expression didn't change. "Then why is the Dark Lord targeting the Potters?" "I don't know." And he didn't, not for certain. Perhaps Voldemort had some additional intelligence. Perhaps he simply found James Potter's defiance more personal, more offensive. Perhaps it was arbitrary, a coin flip dressed up as destiny. Do you want me to try to redirect him toward the Longbottoms instead?" The question landed like a physical blow. Dumbledore looked at Severus and saw no malice in the suggestion, just desperate pragmatism. Save Lily by offering up Alice Longbottom and her son instead. Trade one life for another. Simple, terrible, effective. "No," Dumbledore said, and his voice came out harder than he intended. "No, Severus, we protect both families. We don't choose." Though he had already chosen, hadn't he? By not telling the Longbottoms about the prophecy at all, by focusing his efforts on the Potters, by having this conversation about Lily's safety without a single mention of Alice. Severus nodded, seemingly unaware of the hypocrisy, or perhaps just too focused on his own guilt to notice anyone else's. "What do I do now?" he asked. "Return to Voldemort. Tell him you've heard nothing, learned nothing. Continue as you have been." Dumbledore paused. "And come to me with any information he shares. Anything about his plans, his movements, his state of mind. Everything could matter. He'll expect me to keep searching for the child, to help him hunt the Potters. Then search in ways that lead nowhere. Be enthusiastic but ineffective. Make mistakes that seem natural. You're good at occlumency?" "Yes." A flicker of pride crossed Severus's face. "The best in my year." "It will need to be better than that. Voldemort is a legilimens of extraordinary power. If he suspects you, if he looks too closely, he won't find anything." Severus's jaw set. "I know what I'm risking." Did he? Dumbledore wondered. Did this young man, barely 21, really understand what he was signing up for? Years of pretending, of living in the margins between light and dark, of never being fully trusted by either side, years of watching people die and being unable to prevent it, of carrying secrets that would crush a lesser person, of existing in a state of permanent, corrosive fear. Years of loving someone who would never love him back, had chosen someone else, might die anyway, despite everything he sacrificed. Dumbledore should tell him, should explain exactly what this life would cost, should give him a chance to choose something else. But the Order needed a spy. Harry Potter needed every protection Dumbledore could muster. And Severus Snape, with his guilt and his love and his desperate need for redemption, was offering himself on a platter. "You're very brave," Dumbledore said instead, and watched Severus's face do something complicated. Pleasure at the praise warring with the knowledge that bravery wouldn't save Lily, that nothing might save her, that this could all be for nothing. "Not brave," Severus said quietly. "Just trying to fix what I broke." He left shortly after, slipping out through the wards with the same desperate urgency he'd arrived with. Dumbledore stood at the window and watched him go, a dark shadow crossing the grounds toward the apparition point. Fawkes trilled softly from his perch, a questioning sound. "I know," Dumbledore murmured. "I know." Using Severus was necessary, was strategic, was perhaps even merciful, giving the young man a chance to atone, to do something good with the consequences of his mistakes. But it was also manipulation, was binding someone in their weakest moment, was taking advantage of guilt and love to create a weapon, a tool, a chess piece that would move where Dumbledore needed it to move. Just like keeping the prophecy from the Potters was protection. Just like placing Harry with the Dursleys would be safety. Just like every choice Dumbledore made that prioritized the greater good over individual happiness, control over trust, his judgment over anyone else's agency. For their own good, he told himself, watching the empty grounds where Severus had disappeared. Always for their own good. The justifications came so easily now. Sometimes Dumbledore wondered if that should worry him more than it did. He returned to his desk, to the letter he'd been writing before Severus's arrival. A letter to James and Lily, suggesting, again, that they consider going into hiding, recommending the Fidelius charm, offering his services as secret keeper, not mentioning the prophecy, not explaining why hiding had become not just advisable, but essential, not trusting them with the full truth even now even with Voldemort hunting them, even with their son marked for death or destiny. Dumbledore picked up his quill and continued writing, his hand steady, his words warm and concerned and full of careful omissions. Outside, the October night deepened toward winter. Inside, an old man made choices for other people's lives and called it wisdom. And in the shadows between, Severus Snape walked alone, bound to a cause by love and guilt, carrying secrets that would define the rest of his life, serving two masters, and trusted fully by neither. Dumbledore signed the letter with a flourish and felt nothing at all. The house was rubble. Dumbledore stood in the street outside what had been the Potter cottage and felt the November cold seep through his robes, through his skin, into the marrow of his bones. The roof had collapsed inward, the upper floor sagging at a dangerous angle. Smoke still curled from the wreckage, though the fires had been extinguished hours ago. The whole structure emanated wrongness, the sour residue of dark magic, of killing curses and murder, and lives ended too soon. He was too late, had known he would be too late from the moment Severus had burst into his office 3 hours ago sobbing, screaming that Voldemort had gone to Godric's Hollow, had known it even as he'd gathered the order, sent word to Minerva and Mad-Eye and the others, knowing that by the time they arrived, the thing would already be done, knowing and still hoping, still allowing himself the fiction that perhaps this once speed might matter. Hagrid was there when Dumbledore arrived. The gamekeeper's massive form hunched protectively over something, someone wrapped in blankets. Other Order members moved through the wreckage, wands lit, searching for, what? Survivors? Evidence? Some way to make sense of the senseless? "Headmaster," Hagrid said, and his voice was thick with tears. The boy's alive. Don't know how, but he's breathing." Dumbledore moved forward, his legs feeling curiously distant from the rest of him, and looked down at the bundle in Hagrid's arms. Harry Potter, 1 year and 3 months old, gazed up at him with eyes precisely the shade of his mother's. A lightning bolt cut marked his forehead, still bleeding sluggishly. The child should have been screaming, from pain, from fear, from the trauma of whatever he'd witnessed. Instead, he was eerily quiet, watching Dumbledore with an intensity that seemed wrong in someone so young. His parents, Dumbledore asked, though he already knew, could read the answer in the careful way no one would meet his eyes. "Upstairs," Sirius Black said, emerging from the wreckage. His face was bone-white, his hands shaking. James in the hallway, Lily in the nursery, both dead, and Voldemort. He laughed, and it came out broken, edging toward hysterical. "Voldemort's gone, just gone. His wand, his robes, but nobody. Peter said Peter found them. He said it was like Voldemort just vanished." Peter Pettigrew stood to one side, small and trembling, his watery eyes red from crying. He'd given Sirius the information Dumbledore knew, had been the secret keeper, had told Sirius he'd found the Potters dead. The details were still unclear, would need investigation, but none of that mattered now. James and Lily were dead. Harry was alive, and Voldemort, Dumbledore moved past Sirius into the wreckage, stepped carefully over shattered wood and broken glass, climbed the precarious stairs, found James first, sprawled in the hallway, his wand just beyond his outstretched fingers. His face was frozen in surprise more than fear. It had been fast then. He'd had no time to fight, barely time to understand what was happening. The nursery was worse. Lily lay before the crib, her arms outstretched, as though she'd been trying to shield it with her body. Her red hair fanned around her head like a corona. Her eyes were open, still green, still beautiful, staring at nothing. Dumbledore stood in the doorway and felt something in his chest compress until breathing became a conscious effort. He'd promised Severus he would protect her, had promised with such sincerity, such conviction, had meant it even in the moment. And she was dead anyway. The practical part of his mind, the part that had kept functioning through Ariana's death, through Gellert's betrayal, through 100 losses over 150 years, was already cataloguing what this meant. Voldemort's disappearance, Harry's survival, the scar on the child's forehead, the mark of a killing curse that somehow hadn't killed. The Dark Lord will mark him as his equal. The prophecy had been fulfilled then, or begun to be fulfilled. Voldemort had chosen his target, had tried to eliminate the threat, and somehow that attempt had destroyed him instead. Power, the Dark Lord knows not. Dumbledore knelt beside Lily's body, reached out with a trembling hand to close her eyes. Her skin was already cooling, already taking on that waxy quality of the recently dead. She looked young, so impossibly young. 21 years old, a year out of Hogwarts, should have had decades ahead of her, a lifetime with her husband and son. Should have grown old, seen Harry grow up, had more children perhaps, lived the ordinary, happy life she'd deserved. Instead, she died on a nursery floor, murdered for the crime of standing between a dark wizard and her child. "I'm sorry," Dumbledore whispered, knowing she couldn't hear, knowing it changed nothing. "I'm so sorry, Lily." The apology felt hollow, inadequate. What good were apologies when he'd had the power to prevent this and chosen not to use it? When he'd known about the prophecy, known Voldemort was hunting them, and still kept secrets, still withheld information, still trusted his own judgment over theirs. He could have told them, could have explained exactly why they were targets, given them the prophecy's full weight, could have insisted they make him secret keeper instead of allowing them to choose Peter Pettigrew. Foolish, weak Peter, who'd somehow betrayed them, though the details were still unclear. Could have, should have, didn't. And Lily was dead because of it. By the time Dumbledore descended the stairs, a crowd had gathered. Ministry officials, aurors, reporters already circling like vultures. Fudge was there, looking important and useless in equal measure. Mad-Eye was keeping the reporters back, snarling about crime scenes and evidence, and Hagrid still held Harry, the child now sleeping against the gamekeeper's massive chest. "We need to get him somewhere safe," Sirius said, moving toward Hagrid. "I'll take him. I'm his godfather. No," Dumbledore said quietly. Sirius turned to him, his grey eyes flashing. "What do you mean, no? He's my godson. Lily and James chose me too. And Peter Pettigrew was their secret keeper," Dumbledore interrupted. "Chosen by James, if I recall correctly. That trust was misplaced." Sirius flinched as though struck. You can't possibly think." "I think," Dumbledore said carefully, "that we don't yet know what happened here, that there are questions that need answering, that until we understand how Voldemort found the Potters, until we know who betrayed them, Harry needs to be somewhere absolutely secure. With me," Sirius insisted. "With family. With blood," Dumbledore corrected. "Lily's sacrifice, her death protecting Harry, created magic. Old magic. the kind that lives in blood. Harry's mother's sister shares that blood. If Harry lives with her, if he calls her house home, Lily's protection will remain. It wasn't entirely a lie. The blood protection was real. Would be real if Harry lived with Petunia Dursley. But it was also convenient. A reason to take Harry away from wizarding guardians who might ask questions, who might challenge Dumbledore's decisions, who might raise the boy differently than Dumbledore needed him raised. Safe from fame, safe from adulation, safe from growing up believing he was special, chosen, destined, safe for Dumbledore to shape as needed when the time came. Her sister? Sirius's voice rose. Petunia, you want to send him to live with that muggle woman who hated Lily, who cut her out of her life. It's the safest place for him. It's a prison. Sirius took a step forward. James and Lily would never have wanted. James and Lily are dead. Dumbledore's voice came out harder than he intended, and he saw Sirius flinch again. He softened his tone with effort. They can't tell us what they would have wanted. All we can do is keep Harry safe, and blood protection is the strongest magic we have. Then put protections on my house, Sirius said desperately. Every ward you know, every charm, every... Voldemort is diminished, not destroyed, Dumbledore said. His followers remain. They'll be looking for Harry, looking to finish what their master started. The blood protection will hide him in ways no ward can match. Hagrid shifted, and Harry stirred against him, making a small sound of distress. All eyes turned to the child, and Dumbledore felt the moment's momentum shift. Hagrid, he said quietly. Take Harry to Surrey. Number 4, Privet Drive. I'll meet you there. Yes, sir. Hagrid's face was wet with tears, but he nodded. Poor little Tyke. Lost his whole family in one night. He has his aunt, Dumbledore said, and ignored the way Sirius made a disgusted sound. He'll be safe there. Hagrid, take my motorbike. It will be faster than the train. Your motorbike? Sirius looked between them. You don't have a... He means mine, Sirius said flatly. Of course. Take everything else. Why not take my bike too? But he didn't protest further, just stood there, shaking, looking lost in a way that made him seem younger than his 21 years. Dumbledore watched Hagrid walk away with Harry, the child's dark head visible over the gamekeeper's shoulder. Watched until they disappeared into the November darkness and tried not to think about what he was doing. Tried not to think about the calculations behind it. The way Harry, raised by muggles who wouldn't love him, who might even resent him, would grow up humble, grateful for any scrap of affection, willing to sacrifice himself when the time came because he'd never learned that his own life had value. Tried not to think about how this was the same pattern. Keep secrets, control information, shape lives according to a grand design only he could see. Tried not to think about Lily's body cooling upstairs, about the promise he'd made to Severus, about the trust James and Lily had placed in him when they joined the Order. This is wrong, Sirius said quietly. You know it's wrong. It's necessary, Dumbledore replied. They're the same thing to you, aren't they? Sirius's laugh was bitter. Necessary and right. You decide something needs to happen and suddenly it's the moral choice. Never mind what anyone else wants. If you have a better solution, I want my godson. Sirius's voice broke. I want James and Lily alive. I want to go back 6 hours and stop this from happening. But I can't have any of that, can I? So instead, I get to watch You take the last piece of my best friend and send him to live with people who'll hate him for existing." Dumbledore had no answer for that, because Sirius was right in his way. The Dursleys would hate Harry, would resent his magic, his differentness, his very existence as a reminder of the sister Petunia had lost. And Dumbledore was sending him there anyway. "Go home, Sirius," he said tiredly. "Grieve. We'll sort everything else out in time." He turned away before Sirius could respond, before he had to see the accusation in those grey eyes, had to speak with the ministry officials, had to coordinate the cleanup, had to craft the story that would be told about this night. The boy who lived, they would call Harry, the child who survived the killing curse, the miracle, the weapon, Dumbledore thought, and hated himself for thinking it. Privet Drive was everything Dumbledore had expected: neat, ordinary, aggressively normal, the houses all identical, the lawns all precisely maintained, the cars all sensible family sedans. Number 4 looked exactly like number 3 and number 5, distinguished only by its house number. Hagrid was waiting when Dumbledore arrived, the motorbike parked on the curb, Harry still sleeping in his arms. "Hasn't woken once," Hagrid said quietly. "Poor little thing must be exhausted." McGonagall was there too, in her cat form, watching from a garden wall. She transformed as Dumbledore approached, her face set in lines of disapproval. "So it's true," she said, without preamble. "You're really going to leave him here? With these muggles?" "Minerva." "I've been watching them all day, Albus. All day. The man is a bully. The woman is a gossip. They have a son who is the worst sort of spoiled brat I've ever seen, and I've taught thousands of children." Her Scottish accent thickened with emotion. "These are the worst sort of muggles, and you want to leave Harry, sweet, innocent Harry who just lost everything, with them? They're his only living relatives. They're dreadful. They're safe. Are they?" McGonagall moved closer, her eyes flashing behind her spectacles. "Safe from Death Eaters, perhaps, but safe from neglect, from resentment, from growing up unloved." Dumbledore looked at number 4's door. The knocker gleamed in the streetlight. Behind that door, Petunia Dursley slept, unaware that her nephew, her dead sister's son, was about to be left on her doorstep like an unwanted package. The blood protection is worth sacrificing his childhood for, McGonagall finished. His happiness? You're choosing to make him miserable, Albus, deliberately. I'm choosing to keep him alive. You're choosing to control him. McGonagall's voice dropped. Don't think I haven't noticed the pattern, the secrets you keep, the information you withhold, the way you move people around like chess pieces and call it protection. Minerva, did you tell them? She gestured toward the ruined house that existed miles away, toward the bodies that were even now being moved to St. Mungo's. Did you tell James and Lily about the prophecy? Dumbledore said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the words he couldn't say. You didn't, McGonagall said finally. You knew their son was in danger, specific, prophesied danger, and you didn't tell them, and now they're dead. Telling them wouldn't have saved them. You don't know that. You robbed them of the chance to make informed choices about their own lives, their own son. And now you're doing it again. You're deciding Harry's future without considering what's best for him as a person, only what's best for him as, what? A weapon against Voldemort. Voldemort is gone. You don't believe that. If you did, You wouldn't need the blood protection. You wouldn't be so desperate to hide Harry away. McGonagall shook her head. You think this isn't over? You think Voldemort will return, and you're already planning for it, already positioning Harry exactly where you need him. She was too perceptive, had always been too perceptive. It was what made her an excellent teacher and a dangerous ally. Whether Voldemort returns or not, Dumbledore said carefully, Harry deserves to grow up away from fame, away from people who'll treat him as special because of something that happened when he was too young to remember. He deserves normalcy. He deserves love, McGonagall countered. And he won't find it here. He'll find safety. That will have to be enough. Dumbledore moved past her, toward Hagrid, took Harry from the gamekeeper's arms, felt the child's small weight, his warmth, the gentle puff of his breath against Dumbledore's robes. So small, so vulnerable, so completely at the mercy of Dumbledore's choices. He'd failed Lily, failed to protect her, despite his promises, despite his plans. But perhaps he could still save her son, could keep him alive long enough to fulfill the prophecy, to finish what Voldemort had started, could shape him into exactly what the wizarding world would need. The thought made him feel old, tired, unclean in some fundamental way. But he did it anyway. Dumbledore laid Harry on the doorstep of number 4, Privet Drive, tucked the blankets around him, placed the letter he'd written, full of explanations that explained nothing, requests that would be ignored, pleas that would fall on deaf ears, in the blanket's folds. Harry stirred slightly, his hand curling into a small fist, the lightning bolt scar standing out starkly on his forehead. The Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, marked, orphaned, and now abandoned on a doorstep in the November cold. For the greater good, Dumbledore told himself, for Harry's own safety, for the future only Dumbledore could see clearly enough to plan for. He stood, stepped back, looked down at the small bundle that contained so much hope and so much tragedy. Good luck, Harry Potter, he whispered. Then he turned and walked away, leaving the child sleeping in the cold, and tried not to hear McGonagall's voice behind him. I hope you know what you're doing, Albus. I truly hope you do. Dumbledore kept walking. He'd done what was necessary, what was strategic, what would keep Harry alive and humble and shaped correctly for the role he'd need to play. He'd done everything right. The calculations all added up. The plan was sound, and if it felt like he'd just committed another betrayal, another choice that prioritized control over trust, another manipulation disguised as protection, well, he'd learned to live with that feeling a long time ago. The first report came in December, barely a month after Halloween. The boy is well. The Dursleys have taken him in. No sign of unusual activity in the neighborhood. Mrs. Figg's handwriting was spidery, but precise, her words carefully neutral. Dumbledore read the letter in his office, Fawkes preening quietly on his perch, and felt something ease in his chest. Harry was alive, safe. The blood protection was holding. He filed the letter away and told himself he wouldn't think about the boy again until the next report. He thought about him constantly. By February, Mrs. Figg's letters had developed a certain pattern. The boy was healthy, growing well. The Dursleys were managing. That last word began to carry weight, flavored with things unsaid. Dumbledore noticed but didn't inquire, didn't ask Mrs. Figg to elaborate on what managing meant, what she observed from her careful distance. He told himself Details would only make things harder, that he was protecting Harry by not knowing too much, by maintaining the distance necessary to make difficult choices. In March, he saw Severus for the first time since Halloween. The younger man looked terrible, gaunt, hollow-eyed, moving through the corridors of Hogwarts like a ghost haunting his own life. Dumbledore had given him the potion's position, had kept his promise to protect him from Voldemort's vengeful followers, had offered him sanctuary and purpose. But he couldn't give Severus what he really wanted, couldn't bring Lily back, couldn't erase the guilt that sat behind his eyes like a permanent resident. "How is the boy?" Severus asked one evening, appearing in Dumbledore's office without invitation. "Safe," Dumbledore replied. "Growing. The protection holds." "With the Muggles? The sister?" "Yes." Severus's jaw tightened. "Lily hated her, said Petunia was cruel, jealous. Is he happy there?" Dumbledore could have lied, could have offered easy reassurances. Instead, he said, "He's alive, Severus. That's what matters." Something flickered across Severus's face. Recognition, perhaps, that alive and happy were not the same thing. But he didn't push, just nodded and left, his robes billowing behind him. Dumbledore watched him go and added another small weight to the collection of guilts he carried. Severus deserved to know that his penance, his years of spying and sacrifice, had at least purchased Harry's happiness. But Dumbledore couldn't promise that, wouldn't even check to confirm it, because knowing would only complicate things. Better not to know. Better to maintain distance. Better for whom? A small voice asked. But Dumbledore had long practice ignoring inconvenient questions. The years accumulated like sediment. Mrs. Figg's reports came monthly, then quarterly, then only when something notable occurred, which it rarely did. Harry was healthy, attending the local primary school. No accidental magic incidents, no signs that Voldemort's followers had tracked him down. Everything according to plan. Dumbledore read between the lines sometimes, late at night when sleep wouldn't come. Noticed the things Mrs. Figg didn't say, never mentioned Harry's friends, never described him playing with other children. Her reports focused on physical health, height, weight, absence of injury, as though those were the only metrics that mattered. He told himself it was enough, that a lonely childhood was better than a dead one, that Harry would thank him someday for the protection, even if he never understood its cost. In 1985, Mrs. Figg mentioned in passing that the Dursleys had taken their son to the zoo for his birthday. Harry had stayed home with her, helping tend her cats. He'd been very quiet, she noted, very polite. Dumbledore read that report 3 times, looking for something he couldn't quite name. 4 years old. Other children got birthday outings, got celebrations. Harry got to stay home and be quiet and polite. He almost wrote to Mrs. Figg then, almost asked her to pay more attention, to tell him what Harry's life really looked like beyond the bare facts of his survival. Almost. Instead, he filed the report away and told himself that hardship built character, that Harry would need strength for what was coming, that a little neglect now might save his life later. The justifications came so easily. Dumbledore wondered, sometimes, if that should frighten him more than it did. By 1987, Harry was in primary school full-time. Mrs. Figg reported that his teachers found him bright but reserved. He did his homework, followed rules, never caused trouble. A model student, except for the peculiar incidents that occasionally happened around him. A teacher's wig spontaneously flying off, a window breaking when he was upset, small bursts of accidental magic that the Muggle teachers attributed to coincidence. Normal magical childhood, Dumbledore thought, reading these reports. Proof that Harry's power was developing appropriately. He didn't let himself wonder what the Dursleys did when these incidents occurred, whether they punished Harry for things he couldn't control, whether they were teaching him to fear his own nature, to see his magic as something shameful. Didn't let himself wonder because he couldn't afford to care. Because caring would mean intervening, and intervening would mean disrupting the carefully constructed protection he'd built around the boy. In June of 1988, Dumbledore received a letter from Minerva McGonagall. Albus, I hope this letter finds you well. I'm writing to ask, once again, if you've considered checking on young Harry Potter. He'll be 8 next month. Surely a brief visit wouldn't compromise whatever protection you've placed on him. Several of us have discussed this. Hagrid remains concerned, and even Severus has asked, though he'd deny it if confronted. We all wonder how the boy is faring, whether he knows about his parents, whether he understands who he is. I know you have your reasons for maintaining distance. I know you believe you're protecting him. But Albus, he's a child. Whatever grand plans you have for him, he's still just a child who lost his parents and deserves to know someone cares about his welfare beyond monitoring reports. Please consider visiting him, or allowing one of us to do so. If not for Harry's sake, then for James and Lily's memory. Yours, Minerva Dumbledore, read the letter twice, then placed it in his desk drawer with all the others, the pile of correspondence from people who thought they knew better, who thought sentiment should override strategy. He didn't visit Harry, told himself it was for the boy's protection, that any contact with the magical world would make Harry visible, might draw attention from Death Eaters still hunting for him. Told himself that Harry was better off not knowing about magic yet, about the parents he'd lost, about the world waiting for him. Told himself he was being wise, not cowardly, strategic, not cruel. The lies came so smoothly now. Dumbledore barely noticed them anymore. 1989 brought a concerning report. Harry had been in a fight at school, unusual for him. According to Mrs. Figg's careful investigation, some boys had been teasing him about his clothes, too large apparently, hand-me-downs from his cousin. Harry had lost his temper, and something strange had happened. The boys' shoelaces had tied themselves together, all of them simultaneously. Harry had been punished. Severely, Mrs. Figg noted with unusual directness. She'd heard shouting from number 4 that evening, had seen the boy looking pale and frightened for days afterward. Should I intervene? Mrs. Figg asked at the letter's end. The punishment seemed excessive for a childish altercation. Dumbledore stared at that question for a long time. Should she intervene? Should he? A child being punished severely for accidental magic he couldn't control, being taught to fear his own nature, being broken down piece by piece, year by year, exactly as Dumbledore needed him to be. The thought arrived unbidden, ugly, and undeniable. He wanted Harry humble, wanted him grateful for any scrap of kindness, wanted him willing to sacrifice himself when the time came because he'd never learned his own worth. And the Dursleys were accomplishing that beautifully, without Dumbledore having to dirty his own hands. He wrote back to Mrs. Figg, "Continue observing. Intervene only if the boy's physical safety is threatened. Some discipline is natural in raising children. He sent the letter and felt nothing, or told himself he felt nothing. The tightness in his chest was surely just age, just the accumulated weight of years, not guilt, not shame, not the sick recognition that he was allowing a child to suffer because that suffering served his purposes. In 1990, Harry turned 10. Mrs. Figg sent a birthday report, as she did every year. Harry had spent the day helping her with her cats again. No celebration at number 4. No presents as far as she could tell. Dumbledore read the report and felt something crack in the careful distance he'd maintained. 10 years old. A decade since Halloween night. A decade since Dumbledore had laid him on that doorstep and walked away. How much had Harry changed in 10 years? What did he look like now? Did he have Lily's eyes, still? Or had they changed with age? Did he have James's mischievous spirit? Or had the Dursleys crushed that out of him? Dumbledore found himself pulling out the photograph Hagrid had taken that night. The only picture he had of baby Harry sleeping in his blankets. He studied it in the candlelight of his office, looking for, what? Absolution, permission to care, a reason to maintain his distance. Next year, he murmured to Fawkes, next year he comes to Hogwarts. Next year I can see for myself that he's well, that this was all worth it. Fawkes trilled softly, a sound that might have been comfort or might have been reproach. Dumbledore put the photograph away. One more year? One more year of distance, of reports, of not knowing. One more year of letting the Dursleys shape Harry into exactly what Dumbledore needed. A weapon that didn't know its own value, a sacrifice willing to be made. And if Harry arrived at Hogwarts damaged by that shaping, scarred by years of neglect and punishment and loneliness, well, Dumbledore would deal with that then, would offer kindness and candy and grandfatherly warmth, would make Harry trust him, rely on him, believe in him, would manipulate him all over again, just more gently this time. The plan was sound, strategic, necessary. Dumbledore repeated these words to himself like a prayer, like an absolution he hadn't earned and didn't deserve. In July 1991, Dumbledore finally broke his own rule, told himself he needed to check the wards, needed to verify the blood protection was still holding strong as Harry approached his 11th birthday. But really, he just needed to see. He went to Privet Drive on a Tuesday afternoon under a disillusionment charm, stood across the street from number 4 and waited. The boy who emerged an hour later barely looked like the photographs Dumbledore had studied. Thin, too thin for healthy growth. Dark, messy hair that looked like it had been cut badly with kitchen scissors. Glasses held, together with tape. Clothes that hung on his frame, several sizes too large. But the eyes, even from across the street, Dumbledore could see those eyes. Lily's eyes, green as spring grass, exactly as he remembered. Harry was pulling weeds in the front garden, his movements methodical and joyless. The Dursleys' son, enormously fat, spoiled-looking, rode a bicycle up and down the street, shouting at Harry to move faster, work harder. Harry ignored him, just kept pulling weeds, his small face set in lines of patient endurance that no 11-year-old should have mastered. Dumbledore watched for an hour, watched Harry finish the weeding, then wash the car, then carry in groceries while the Dursley boy played. Watched the family go inside for dinner, all of them together, Harry trailing last, small and silent and separate, even among people who should have been family. He should feel satisfaction. His plan had worked perfectly. Harry was exactly what Dumbledore had intended. Humble, hard-working, expecting nothing. Instead, he felt sick. This was his doing, his choice. He'd known the Dursleys would be cruel, had known and sent Harry anyway, had maintained distance for 11 years not to protect the boy, but to protect himself. From guilt, from second-guessing, from having to witness the consequences of his decisions. Dumbledore disapparated and returned to Hogwarts, sat in his office while night fell and stared at nothing. In a month, Harry would receive his Hogwarts letter, would enter the magical world, would begin the journey Dumbledore had been planning since before the boy's birth. And Dumbledore would welcome him with warmth and kindness and candy, would make himself into the grandfather Harry had never had, would earn the boy's trust and affection and loyalty, would use that trust to lead Harry exactly where he needed him to go when the time came, for the greater good, always, always for the greater good. The words tasted like ash, but Dumbledore spoke them anyway, into the darkness of his office, and waited for his conscience to stop screaming. It took longer than usual that night, but eventually, as always, it fell silent. The Sorting Hat had barely touched Harry Potter's head before Dumbledore knew everything he needed to know. The boy sat on the stool, drowning in Hogwarts robes that were actually his size, but still looked too large on his thin frame. His face was tilted upward, green eyes wide behind those taped glasses, and Dumbledore could see the wonder there, the desperate hope, the barely suppressed joy of a child who'd been starving and had just discovered a feast. Perfect. The hat deliberated longer than usual, nearly 5 minutes, which was unusual enough that the Great Hall grew restless. Dumbledore watched Harry's face cycle through emotions, uncertainty, fear, something that looked like internal argument, and then, finally, determination. "Gryffindor!" the table erupted. Harry stumbled toward the red and gold, looking dazed, and was swallowed up in celebration. Dumbledore watched him sit beside Ron Weasley, watched the boys start talking immediately, watched Harry's face transform with the simple gift of acceptance. The hat had wanted to put him in Slytherin. Dumbledore would bet his considerable fortune on it. But Harry had argued against it, had chosen differently, had picked Gryffindor for reasons Dumbledore could guess. James had been Gryffindor. The brave house, the good house, the opposite of everything Harry feared he might be. Already making choices based on inadequate information, already trying so hard to be what he thought others wanted, exactly as Dumbledore had known he would. The feast continued. Dumbledore made his start-of-term speech, warned the students away from the third-floor corridor, and watched Harry listen with that intense focus that suggested he heard warnings as challenges, also exactly as planned. The stone was in the school by October, hidden beneath protections Dumbledore had carefully calibrated. Not too difficult. A first year shouldn't be able to reach it, but a clever first year with help might manage. The mirror of Aerist in the final chamber, configured to release the stone only to someone who wanted to find it, but not use it. A test, essentially. Though Dumbledore told himself it was protection, just like everything else. He monitored Harry through the first months, with careful attention. The boy was thriving in some ways, making friends, learning magic, discovering talents he'd never known he possessed. But he was also trouble, in the particular way of children who'd learned to distrust authority and make their own decisions. Halloween brought a troll in the dungeons. Dumbledore arrived to find Harry and Ron Weasley standing over an unconscious mountain troll, Hermione Granger trembling beside them, all three covered in troll bogies and adrenaline. "What were you thinking?" Minerva demanded, her face pale with fear that came out as anger. "She didn't know about the troll," Harry said, stepping forward instinctively to shield Hermione. "We had to warn her, protecting others already, willing to take punishment to keep a friend safe. The Dursleys had taught him to be invisible, to avoid notice, but they hadn't crushed the essential nobility that lived in James and Lily's son. Dumbledore awarded points for sheer dumb luck and watched Harry glow with pride. Such a small thing, points and praise. But the boy responded like he'd been given treasure. 11 years of neglect meant 11 years of hunger for approval. Dumbledore could work with that. By December, Harry had found the Mirror of Erist. Dumbledore had known he would, had positioned it specifically where a curious boy with an invisibility cloak would eventually stumble across it. He watched from the shadows as Harry sat before it, night after night, staring at the family he'd never known. Lily and James smiled at their son from the glass, surrounded by relatives and ancestors. All the love Harry had been denied rendered in perfect reflection. Dumbledore let him come back 3 times before intervening. "Back again, Harry." The boy jumped, whirling around with the cloak half off, his face guilty and desperate. "Professor Dumbledore, I didn't—" "It shows us nothing more or less than the deepest desires of our hearts," Dumbledore said gently, moving to stand beside the mirror. Not looking at his own reflection. He'd learned long ago not to look at what the mirror showed him. "You, who have never known your family, see them standing beside you. But remember, this mirror gives us neither knowledge nor truth. Men have wasted away before it, entranced by what they see." "What do you see, sir?" Harry asked, and the question was so earnest, so trusting. Dumbledore smiled. "I see myself holding a pair of thick woolen socks. One can never have enough socks." A lie, of course, but a lie that made Harry laugh, that made him trust Dumbledore's wisdom and kindness, that taught him the headmaster was approachable and honest and safe. The manipulation was so smooth, Dumbledore barely noticed it anymore. "The mirror will be moved tomorrow," he continued. "I ask you not to go looking for it again. It does not do to dwell on dreams and forget to live." Harry nodded, reluctant but obedient. Dumbledore watched him leave, and then stood alone in the room, carefully not looking at his own reflection. If he had looked, he would have seen Ariana alive and whole, seen his family intact, his sister grown to adulthood, the summer of 1899 erased and rewritten, would have seen himself without blood on his hands and guilt in his heart. But he didn't look. He'd learned that lesson at least, even if he'd failed to learn so many others. Spring brought exactly the crisis Dumbledore had anticipated. Harry had noticed Severus's suspicious behavior, had convinced himself that the potion's master was after the stone, had decided, with Ron and Hermione, to protect it themselves. Dumbledore monitored the situation carefully, made sure he was called away to London at precisely the right moment, made sure the protections were passable but not impossible, made sure Harry would have just enough rope to either save himself or hang himself with. A test, he told himself. Not manipulation, just observation. He returned to Hogwarts to find Harry in the hospital wing, unconscious, Voldemort's failed possession attempt written in the burns on his skin where Quirrell had touched him. Dumbledore sat beside the bed and looked at the small figure beneath white sheets. 11 years old and already facing Voldemort. Already learning that he would have to fight, have to sacrifice, have to stand between the darkness and the innocent. "I'm sorry," Dumbledore whispered, knowing Harry couldn't hear. "But you did wonderfully. So brave, so strong, so perfectly manipulated into doing exactly what Dumbledore had needed him to do." When Harry woke, Dumbledore was there with candy and warm words and careful explanations that explained almost nothing. He told Harry about Lily's protection, about love being a powerful magic, told him about Voldemort's fear of death, his inability to understand sacrifice, taught Harry that his value lay in his willingness to die for others, that love meant martyrdom, that protection required sacrifice, planted seeds that would bloom years later when Dumbledore needed Harry to walk into the forest and accept death. Harry listened with those green eyes wide and trusting, and Dumbledore hated himself for a moment, so sharp and brief it barely registered. Then the moment passed. The justifications returned. Harry was alive. Voldemort was defeated. The plan was working, all according to design. Second year brought the Chamber of Secrets, and with it another test. Dumbledore hadn't planned for, but used anyway. He watched Harry become isolated, watched the school turn against him when he revealed his Parseltongue, watched the boy struggle with the fear that he might be dark, might be Slytherin, might be the heir everyone thought he was. Dumbledore could have intervened, could have announced publicly that Parseltongue didn't make someone evil, that Harry was beyond suspicion, could have protected the boy from the whispers and the fear. Instead, he let it play out. Let Harry learn to stand alone, to trust himself when no one else would, to make the right choices even when frightened. More character building, more preparation for a war Harry didn't know was coming. When Harry descended into the chamber, Dumbledore wasn't there to stop him. When he faced the basilisk and the memory of Tom Riddle, he faced them alone. When he nearly died, it was Fawkes who saved him. Fawkes, whom Dumbledore had sent, but only just in time. Calculated risk. The boy needed to learn he could survive impossible odds, needed to develop the confidence that would carry him through worse trials later. And if he died, well, Dumbledore tried not to think about that possibility too directly. "You showed great courage," Dumbledore told Harry afterward, in this same hospital wing, beside this same bed. "Not just in facing the basilisk, but in your choices. You chose to save Ginny Weasley rather than pursue the monster. You chose to destroy the diary rather than use it for information. These were brave choices, Harry. Good choices." Harry soaked up the praise like parched earth soaked up rain. 12 years old, and still so hungry for approval, for acknowledgement, for someone to tell him he'd done well. Dumbledore gave him that, gave him warmth and candy and grandfatherly pride, gave him everything except the full truth. Third year was serious, and that complicated everything. Dumbledore had known Black was innocent, had suspected from the start that Peter Pettigrew was the more likely traitor. But investigating would have meant admitting he'd been wrong, would have meant Harry having a guardian who might question Dumbledore's choices, might interfere with the careful shaping of the boy's character, so he'd let Sirius rot in Azkaban for 12 years. Let Harry believe himself alone in the world. Let the tragedy stand uncorrected because it served Dumbledore's purposes. When the truth finally emerged, when Harry and Hermione used the time turner to save Sirius, Dumbledore felt something that might have been relief. Harry had his godfather now, had family, had someone who loved him unconditionally. But Sirius was on the run, couldn't take Harry from the Dursleys, couldn't interfere with the blood protection Dumbledore insisted was essential. Perfect. Harry got the emotional connection he needed, the sense of having someone who cared. But Dumbledore maintained control of the practical arrangements. "Your godfather is a good man," Dumbledore told Harry gently. "He loves you very much, and even though you cannot live with him yet, you have him in your life now. That's worth a great deal." Harry's face had transformed with joy. "Can I write to him? Can he visit?" "In time, when it's safe. For now, letters will have to suffice." Dumbledore paused. "And you must continue returning to your aunt and uncle's house. The protection there is still essential." "But Sirius cannot provide the same protection," Dumbledore said firmly. "Your mother's sacrifice lives in your aunt's blood. As long as you call her house home, you are safe from Voldemort's followers." It was true as far as it went. The blood protection was real. But Dumbledore could have found other ways to protect Harry, could have made Grimmauld Place safe, could have built wards and charms and protections that didn't require sending the boy back to people who hated him. Could have, didn't. Because Harry returning to the Dursleys every summer meant Harry staying humble, staying grateful for Hogwarts, staying shaped correctly for the role he'd need to play. Dumbledore was protecting him, just not from the things that actually hurt. Fourth year brought the tournament, and with it the return Dumbledore had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Voldemort was back. The prophecy was in motion again, and Harry had been dragged into a competition designed to kill him. Dumbledore should have stopped it, should have investigated how Harry's name entered the goblet, should have found a way to withdraw him from the tournament, should have protected him from the obvious trap. Instead, he let it proceed. Let Harry face dragons and merpeople and mazes full of monsters. Let him grow stronger, braver, more confident. Let him learn to survive things that should kill him, because that was a skill he'd need soon enough. When Harry returned from the graveyard, clutching Cedric Diggory's body, when he told his story of Voldemort's resurrection, with tears streaming down his face, Dumbledore looked at him and saw a weapon almost fully forged, 14 years old, traumatized, but unbroken. "You've been so brave, Harry," Dumbledore said softly, in the hospital wing, always the hospital wing. "Braver than I had any right to ask. I know this year has been terrible. I know you've lost someone you cared about, but you survived. You're still here, and that matters more than you know." Harry had looked at him with those green eyes, Lily's eyes, and said, "Sir, why does he keep trying to kill me? What does he want?" The prophecy sat between them, unspoken. Dumbledore could have told him then, could have explained that Harry was marked for death or victory, that the prophecy bound them together, that one of them had to die for the other to live, could have given him the truth. "Voldemort fears you," Dumbledore said instead, "fears what you represent. That's why he tried to kill you as a baby, and why he'll try again. But fear makes him reckless. We can use that. More manipulation, more partial truths, more teaching Harry that he was valuable, primarily as a weapon against Voldemort, that his purpose was to stand between the darkness and the light. Harry nodded, accepting it, trusting Dumbledore's wisdom. And Dumbledore felt nothing, or told himself he felt nothing. The tightness in his chest was just age, just weariness, just the weight of necessary choices, not guilt, never guilt. 5th year was harder. Harry arrived angry at Dumbledore for the silence of the summer, angry at the world for Cedric's death, angry at himself for surviving. The boy who'd been so eager for approval now bristled at authority, questioned orders, demanded answers. Dumbledore should have welcomed it, should have been glad Harry was developing independence, questioning blind obedience. Instead, he withdrew further, stopped meeting Harry's eyes, ostensibly to protect him from Voldemort's mental connection, but really to avoid the accusation he saw there, stopped offering warmth and guidance, let Harry stumble through the year alone, learning through pain what Dumbledore could have taught him directly. The Department of Mysteries was a disaster. Dumbledore had known about the Prophecies' location, had known Voldemort would use it to lure Harry, had known and still let events unfold. Another test, another lesson learned through suffering. When Sirius died, when Harry's anguished screams echoed through the Ministry, Dumbledore felt something crack in the careful distance he'd maintained. He'd killed Sirius. Not directly, Bellatrix had done that. But Dumbledore had set the board, had positioned the pieces, had known the risks and let everyone play anyway. Just like he'd killed Lily and James, just like he'd killed Cedric, just like he'd killed everyone who died because Dumbledore's grand design required sacrifices he wasn't willing to make himself. "Sir," Harry had said, standing in the destroyed office, surrounded by shattered silver instruments and Fawkes's mournful song. "Why didn't you tell me? About the prophecy, about why Voldemort wants to kill me. Why did you keep it secret?" And Dumbledore, looking at this 15-year-old boy who'd lost so much, had finally told him some portion of the truth. Not all of it, never all of it, but enough to make Harry understand he was marked for death or murder, that the prophecy bound him to Voldemort, that one of them had to kill the other. Enough to make Harry understand his life had never really belonged to him at all. "I cared about your happiness more than your knowledge," Dumbledore said, which was a lie so enormous it nearly choked him. "I wanted you to have a normal childhood as long as possible." Harry had looked at him with ancient eyes in a young face. "I've never had a normal childhood, sir. You made sure of that when you left me with the Dursleys." The accusation hung in the air between them. Dumbledore could have confessed then, could have admitted that the Dursleys were chosen specifically to keep Harry humble, that the neglect was calculated, that every choice had been made to shape Harry into a weapon. Could have told the truth. "I'm sorry," he said instead. "I'm so sorry, Harry, for all of it. I made mistakes. I kept secrets I shouldn't have kept. His voice caught. "I care about you more than I should, more than is wise, and that made me try to protect you from knowledge that might hurt you. But I see now that was wrong. You deserved the truth. Not the full truth, never the full truth, but enough truth to rebuild trust. Enough vulnerability to make Harry believe Dumbledore had learned, had changed, would be better. Enough manipulation to keep the weapon sharp and pointed in the right direction. Harry had left his office still angry, still grieving, but also still trusting, still willing to follow where Dumbledore led, still perfectly positioned to make the sacrifice Dumbledore would eventually require. Dumbledore sat alone in his office after Harry left and looked at his hands. They were steady. They'd been steady through every death, every manipulation, every choice that prioritized the greater good over individual happiness. They'd been steady when he left Harry on the Dursleys' doorstep, steady when he let Sirius rot in prison, steady when he sent Harry into danger again and again, steady now after 15 years of shaping a child into a sacrifice. Some part of him thought they should shake, thought he should feel something beyond this terrible familiar numbness. But his hands were steady. They'd always been steady. And that, perhaps, was the most damning thing of all. The curse was killing him slowly, which was almost amusing in its irony. Dumbledore had spent a lifetime making calculated decisions about other people's deaths, and now his own arrived like a bill coming due, inevitable, approaching, marked in his deteriorating hand with its blackened fingers and creeping necrosis. Severus had contained it mostly, had prevented it from spreading beyond his hand into his heart. But containment wasn't cure, and they both knew it. A year, perhaps, maybe less. Not nearly enough time to finish everything that needed finishing. Dumbledore sat in his office on a June evening, watching the sunset paint the grounds in shades of amber and gold, and thought about time, how he'd wasted it and hoarded it and spent it like currency on plans that kept expanding, consequences that kept multiplying. The door opened without a knock. Severus, then. Only Severus entered without permission anymore. "You wanted to see me," Severus said flatly, his black robes making him seem like a piece of shadow detached from the growing darkness. "Sit, please." Severus sat, his posture rigid, his dark eyes wary. They'd had this dynamic for 15 years now. Dumbledore asking things, Severus providing them, both of them bound together by guilt and manipulation and the ghost of Lily Potter. "I'm dying," Dumbledore said, because there was no point in softening it. Severus's expression didn't change. "I'm aware. The curse will reach your heart within the year. Before that happens, I need you to do something for me, something terrible." "How novel," Severus said, and the bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. "What sacrifice do you require this time, headmaster?" Dumbledore looked at him, this man he'd used and shaped and bound to service through promises he couldn't keep, and felt the weight of what he was about to ask settle over him like a shroud. "I need you to kill me." The silence that followed was absolute. Severus stared at him, his face draining of what little color it usually held. "What?" "The Elder Wand," Dumbledore said quietly. "It's mine, has been for decades, and Voldemort is searching for it, has been searching for years. When he discovers I possess it, and he will discover it, he'll come for me, or send someone to kill me and claim the wand." "Then let him," Severus said, his voice tight. "Let him kill you and take his cursed wand. What do I care? Because if he kills me, he becomes the wand's master. And with the Elder Wand, with that kind of power," Dumbledore paused, "he'll be truly unstoppable. Harry won't stand a chance." "Harry," Severus repeated, and something flickered across his face. "Always Harry. Everything is always for Harry Potter." "Everything is for ending Voldemort," Dumbledore corrected. "Harry is simply the instrument, the one marked by prophecy to do what must be done." And what must be done? This was it, then. The moment to reveal the final piece of the design Dumbledore had been constructing for 16 years. The moment to admit what he'd shaped Harry into, what he'd been preparing the boy for all along. Harry is a Horcrux, Dumbledore said. Part of Voldemort's soul lives inside him, placed there the night Voldemort tried to kill him. As long as that piece of soul remains, Voldemort cannot truly die. Severus went very still. You're saying... I'm saying that for Voldemort to be destroyed, Harry must die. Dumbledore forced himself to meet Severus's eyes. Must let Voldemort kill him. Willingly, without fighting back. No. Severus stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. No. I've spent 16 years protecting Lily's son. I've risked everything, endured everything, for her memory, Dumbledore interrupted gently. For her sacrifice to mean something. And it does mean something, Severus. It means Harry can die and live again, because Lily's protection still runs in his blood. Voldemort took that blood when he resurrected himself, created a tether that will anchor Harry to life even when Voldemort tries to kill him. You think, Severus said, his voice shaking. You theorize. You're gambling his life on a theory. I'm gambling everything on it, Dumbledore agreed, because it's the only way, the only path I can see that ends with Voldemort destroyed and the wizarding world free. Severus turned away, his hands clenched into fists. And if you're wrong, if he dies and stays dead, then we'll have failed. Then Lily's sacrifice will have been for nothing. Then, Dumbledore's voice caught. Then I'll have spent 16 years raising a child to slaughter, and all my careful plans will amount to murder. They amount to murder anyway, Severus said quietly. You know that, don't you? All your talk of the greater good, all your justifications, you're still sending a 17-year-old boy to die. Yes. The admission came out as a whisper. Yes, I am. And you want me to kill you first. Before the curse does it, before Voldemort can claim the wand through me. Dumbledore stood, moved to the window. If you kill me, at my request, as a mercy, the wand's power will die with me, or pass to you, but you'll never use it, will you? You'll hide it with my body and let its power end. Unless someone defeats me, which is why the plan must be precise. Dumbledore turned back to face him. Draco Malfoy has been ordered to kill me. Voldemort expects him to fail, but wants to punish Lucius. When Draco confronts me, when he disarms me, technically the wand's allegiance will pass to him. But he won't know it, won't claim it. And when you kill me immediately after, the chain will be broken, confused. The wand's power will fracture. Severus was shaking his head slowly. You've thought of everything, every angle, every manipulation. Do you even hear yourself? You're arranging your own murder like it's a chess game. It is a chess game, Dumbledore said tiredly. It's always been a chess game. And I've been playing it for so long, I've forgotten how to do anything else. When? Next year, when circumstances align. I'll know when the time is right. Dumbledore moved to his desk, withdrew a small vial of silvery memory. When it happens, you'll need to give Harry this. It contains everything he needs to know about the Horcruxes, about his own fate, about what he must do. You're not going to tell him yourself. How can I? Dumbledore looked at the memory in his hand. How can I look at that boy, Lily's son, James's son, a child I've known since he was 11, and tell him I've been preparing him to die, that every kindness I've shown him, every lesson I've taught him, every trial I've put him through has been to make him willing to walk into the forest and let himself be murdered? So you'll make me do it instead. Severus's laugh was bitter. Of course. Why should you have to bear the weight of telling him? Why should you have to see the betrayal in his eyes? Better to be dead, better to be remembered fondly. Let Snape be the villain. Let Snape carry that guilt too. I'm sorry, Dumbledore said, and meant it. I'm sorry for all of it, Severus, for using you, for binding you to this through Lily, for asking you to kill me and then break Harry's heart and then watch him die. I'm sorry that my grand design requires so much from you and offers so little in return. Your apologies mean nothing. I know. They stood in silence, the office darkening around them as the sun finished setting. Two men bound together by choices made long ago, by deaths they couldn't prevent and deaths they'd caused, by a war that had cost them everything and would cost them more still before it ended. I'll do it, Severus said finally. Not for you, not even for the greater good, but for Lily. So her death means something. So her son has a chance. Thank you. Don't thank me. Don't ever thank me. Severus moved toward the door, then paused. When you're dead, when I've killed you and Harry hates me and Voldemort thinks I'm his most loyal servant, when all of that comes to pass and I'm alone with what I've done, I hope you're watching from whatever afterlife you believe in. I hope you see exactly what your plans cost, what they cost all of us. He left, robes billowing, and Dumbledore was alone. He returned to the window, looked out over the grounds one more time, somewhere out there. Harry was enjoying his summer before 6th year. Somewhere, Voldemort was growing stronger. Somewhere, the war was building toward its terrible conclusion. And Dumbledore, who'd spent a lifetime trying not to rule the world, sat in his tower and ruled it anyway, through secrets and manipulations and carefully orchestrated deaths, his own included. For the greater good, he told himself, one last time. Always, always, for the greater good. The words rang hollow now, had been hollow for years perhaps, but Dumbledore spoke them anyway into the darkness and waited for absolution that would never come. His hands, resting on the windowsill, were steady. They'd always been steady. Even now, at the end of everything, they didn't shake. And that steadiness, that calm certainty in his own terrible rightness, was perhaps the most damning thing of all.